The market under the tamarind tree smelled of fried cassava and jasmine. Sun baked the corrugated roofs into a steady, metallic heat. A fan in Laya's stall moaned instead of moving the air. Sarian's hands were stained with indigo from a bolt of cloth as she folded scarves, each seam a small, deliberate stitch. The rumor came as a hand too near the hem. Maurice Sam's truck idling at the edge of the square, his laugh a bright stone thrown into the summer hush. Someone said his palm had closed where it should not have. Someone else tightened the thread between them. If you'll stay until the middle and the end of this story, subscribe and leave a like. There's more to see about how communities hold one another accountable. Sarian could have let the day go on. She kept the stall where the shade pooled and sold scarves by the measure of the touch they made against a shoulder. Cool linen for market mornings, heavier wool for the months when the river ran low. She had always measured risk the way she measured cloth, by weight, by how it took the seam. Maurice had been a rumor before he was a man with a smile, a boy who left and returned with new shirts and older debts. He leaned on charm the way some people leaned on canes, casually, with the practiced weight of someone who expected help to bend to him. The first backstory paragraph arrived like a slow current. In the house where Sarian grew up, a roof leaked in one corner, and the family kept a single-stitched blue scarf folded under a loose floorboard. Her father left before the scarf burned, left in the shape of a wet shirt and a slammed door. The scarf had been singed once in the ember of a night someone called a fight, but that evening held more silence than explanation. Sarian would sometimes press the rough edge to her lip and name what she feared in order: leaving, fire, the taste of acrid smoke. The second paragraph slid downstream into another memory, a schoolroom where Thomas Rivera once bought her a pencil and later became one of the few who knew how to tabulate the small, honest debts of a life. She remembered the rasp of the teacher's voice and the smell of chalk. She remembered being small enough to hide a seam rip behind a book. The burned blue scarf had been her mother's, and the new seam she made at 12 was crooked but stubborn, proof that repair was possible without certainty of mending. In the third memory, there was the river, low stones, water like glass under a thin film, a place where Grandfather Heron taught her how to press out stains with sand and sunlight. He always said that water could clean most things, but not every shape held by a hand. Some marks needed the slow work of reweaving, the patient insistence of a needle. The burnt scarf, the absent father, the river's small lessons, these were stitches she carried into adulthood, small, secret rules for safeguarding what remained of her life. The market day after the touch claim escalated in degrees. A boy ran to Laya's bakery with the news. Laya's hands paused in the dough, and she tasted salt as if to locate truth. Pastor James came later, walking slow and careful under the tamarind shade, his hymn book sweating glue where pages met his palm. Mira, who sold incense at the north stall, lowered her head and added a stick of frankincense to the smoke as if prayers could be traded for facts. Maurice hovered near the truck, charm on and practiced, his briefcase a flat brown oval of business and promises. Tomas stood a few stalls away, a person whose patience had the quiet muscle of someone who had kept attendance records for years and counted names the way others count coin. That evening at Sarian's small house, the family scene was a succession of short exchanges, each line a sound or scent threaded with feeling. "Did he touch you?" Rosa asked, and the smell of rosemary came with her voice. "He let his hand close too long," Sarian said, thread between two fingers catching the lamp's light. "Show me," Rosa breathed, as if a bruise could be read like a list, and the house smelled of boiled plantain. "He brushed the seam of the scarf, near the edge where I fold," Sarian said. The syllables were neat as stitches. "Was he drunk?" Grandpa Heron asked, tobacco on his breath. "No," Sarian said. The faint oil of machine grease hovered in her memory instead. "Tomas will stand with you," Rosa said, her voice like the scrape of a needle on wood. "I don't want to fight," Sarian replied, thread humming against skin. "You fought fires before," Grandpa Heron said, his pipe smoke soft as old denim. "You mend or you move, no shame in mending." The rumor grew teeth. Maurice's presence at the market had been mistaken for an attempt at reconciliation by some. For others, his truck's plate and the contracts he now carried with thin-smiled gloss were signs of leverage. Mayor Ortega called a town meeting 2 nights later, an effort to translate noise into order. The mayor's office smelled of lemon oil and paper. A municipal clerk sorted petitions with practiced hands. Maurice, when he spoke to the mayor, dropped references to development projects like coins that could buy goodwill. His vulnerability was offered like a measured confession. His mother had died when he was young, he said once, and that hurt explained a lot. It softened some ears. It did not make his palm right. The town divided along familiar lines, those whose livelihoods intersected with Maurice's contracts and those who could not. Be paid to trade truth for convenience. Rosa sat in the church meeting and listened as Pastor James counseled measured patience while Tomas paced at the doorway. Mira prayed quietly in the back, and Leela, who mended torn sails at the dock, gripped her mug until the porcelain creaked. A vandalism scrape came one humid dawn. The well outside Sarian's house had been plastered with red paint, a smear that read like a crude accusation. Someone had tossed a stone through Leia's window. The scrape felt like a fresh cut. On the wood it settled, not violent, but intimate enough to be cruel. Sarian washed the paint with river water and a rag until blisters rose on her palm. The mark on her forehead from the day Maurice supposedly gripped her was not a bruise any longer, but a place tenderness avoided. She kept the hand there as if to feel the heat and see whether it still flared. The community watched the cleaning. Grandpa Heron came with a bucket, Mira with a sprig of basil, Tomas with an armful of old rags. The mid-story pause came as a breath. The weight of gossip, the smell of paint and starch and frying oil. Pause and breathe, Sarian told herself. If this story has touched you, if you live in a town with a tree and a market and the ache of small public reckonings, leave a comment beginning with the words, "I come from," followed by one sentence describing your town or village. It helps us hold the map of small places together. After the pause, pressure did not slacken. Maurice offered hush money in the shape of envelopes at the edge of stalls. Some took coins and folded them into their palms with the same embarrassed hunger as someone taking bread. Others, Rosa among them, turned the envelopes away and let the coins clink back into his hand. Tomas began to collect named witnesses, listing people who had seen Maurice near the stalls at certain hours. His notepad smelled faintly of tea and chalk. Pastor James encouraged a mediator. Mayor Ortega offered a letter of intention for a public inquiry. Sarian filed a formal complaint at the municipal hall. The intake officer stamped her receipt and wrote a case number in blue ink. The official steps were precise and dull by design, as if bureaucracy itself were a form of sanctuary. A legal paragraph, arranged and concise. Complaint filed with intake officer, receipt and case number issued, forensic request lodged, witness intake scheduled within 14 days, preliminary hearing set within 30 days, interim measures reviewed at 67 days. The intake officer wrote the timeline into the form and slid it across the counter with a small, non-committal kindness. Maurice's complexity showed in a few small moments that did not erase what he had done. In the quiet of a late afternoon, he sat on the market steps and told an old friend about a father who spent years on the road, about the hunger that had shaped a man who traded favors for survival. He pressed his thumb into the seam of an old photograph to smooth a crease. It read almost human. It read insufficient. He was capable of tenderness. He once delivered bread to Leia's stall when her son was ill, but that tenderness did not excuse his hand. 3 puncture moments marked the rise of anxiety, each a sudden, tight thing meant to be felt like a sting. Memory bruise, approximately 540 characters. Sarian closed her eyes and felt the memory as if it were a burn. The touch was not violent in the way a broken bone is violent. It was electric, a closing of space where there should have been air. She recalled the briefness of the contact, the smell of motor oil from Maurice's cuff, the way her scarf crumpled under his palm. The bruise lived under her skin like a secret weather. It hurt most when she tried to laugh. In the mirror, she tapped the seam and counted the stitches as if they could hold the pain at bay. Vandalism scrape. Night had been a wet coat when someone smeared red across the well. The paint dried into the grain of the wood like a promise that would not keep. Sarian rubbed at it with a rag until her knuckles bled salt and water. The town watched at the fence, a chorus of breaths and conjecture. Someone muttered a curse. Someone else whispered that coins could buy silence. The scrape on the well became a bruise on the town's skin, small, conspicuous, and wet with rumor. Bottle breaking at hearing. In the municipal hall, the bottle struck the terrazzo and shattered, a bloom of glass and sound that stopped words mid-sentence. It was not an act of grand malice, only an accidental swing from an angry hand. But the noise was surgical. It revealed the brittle certainty beneath polite faces. The shards glittered like accusations. Mira scooped a shard into her palm and turned it over as if reading a pulse. The bottle's breaking echoed like a fault line, and for a moment the room remembered itself as a place that could crack. A short procedural interlude gathered witnesses and paperwork. Officer Ellis took statements and recorded serial numbers for complaint forms. The municipal clerk filed receipts. Tomas organized names onto a typed list. The mayor assigned a small committee to observe the interim measures. The committee's mandate was modest and public: oversee access to the river pump, monitor Maurice's municipal contracts, and maintain an open ledger to receive community donations for legal fees. When the formal hearing arrived, the market under the tamarind tree swelled into an audience. The hall smelled of dust and citrus polish. The tamarind's leaves tapped like a slow applause outside. Tomas sat rigid, fingers folded. Mayor Ortega read a prepared statement with the practiced cadence of someone who knew the value of steady speech. Pastor James waited at the back, hymn book shut, the paper of it smelling faintly of incense. Laya stood near the doorway, flour on her apron like the residue of small, honest labor. Leela's hands stayed clenched. Grandpa Heron sat forward as if to lean on the bench with his whole body. Named reactions assembled like notes in a score. Tomas's quiet nod. Mayor Ortega's smooth moderation. Rosa's pressed lips. Laya's sharp intake of breath. Leela's clenched hand. Grandpa Heron's slow exhale. Pastor James's steady gaze. Officer Ellis's pen poised. Mira's damp eyes. Each face was a witness. Each body an instrument of the town's moral temperature. Maurice took the stand with a measured smile, and the room tasted of metal and anticipation. The crucial moment arrived when a small envelope slid across a bench and Maurice's counsel denied its contents with a slickness meant to redirect attention. Tomas then produced a series of receipts, small, battered invoices that showed Maurice's payments to a contractor and a previously unknown ledger of consultations. A witness, Mira, stood and recounted seeing Maurice at the edge of the market the day of the incident, not as a man apologizing, but as a man calculating. The air in the hall tightened. Someone in the back muttered that money could not stitch everything. The mayor's mouth pressed into a line that looked almost like worry. At the peak, a bottle, someone's thermos of coffee, was accidentally knocked, and the crash of ceramic punctured an argument. The sound acted like a spotlight. Officer Ellis called for order. The committee's chair appealed to procedure. In the flurry that followed, a paper trail slid into light. Deposits made into a shell account traced back to a contractor close to Maurice. An audit of municipal contracts, already quiet in a drawer, sprouted questions. The private confrontation came later, compressed and hot like a held breath. Maurice found Sarian by the river filter where she washed the stain from the well. He said he wanted only to make amends, his voice thin with something that could be mistaken for remorse. Sarian watched the shadow of his hand and felt the space between apology and accountability. "You can give me words," she said, "or you can let them be on record." He offered the small old photo he kept folded, a father and a boy by a broken fence. She held it and did not fold it back the same way. The choice lay open: take the apology or insist on the ledger. Evidence and the named witnesses changed the calculus. The audit committee recommended temporary suspension of Maurice's municipal contracts pending investigation. Mayor Ortega, who had once warmed to Maurice's promises, called for the withdrawal of a discretionary development grant and for a public letter acknowledging the complaint and the interim measures. Maurice's charm recalibrated into a defensive human posture. He arranged apologies and then watched them be cataloged rather than believed. The jar of coins appeared in the market like a small altar. Sarian and Tomas placed it beneath the tamarind tree and labeled it plainly: Legal Fund, Community Oversight. People came and dropped coins, some in shame, some with a steady clack of commitment. Leia handed over the week's float wrapped in paper. Grandpa Haran tipped in a tin and a story about a boy who mended sails. Mira added a silver coin and said nothing. The jar was counted and recorded weekly. Its ledger was posted on the municipal notice board where anyone could see who had given and why. Repair took shape in small public acts. The committee organized a class in mending and labor rights. Sarian taught a session on seams and boundaries, on how a seam can be invisible and strong. A fund paid for a counseling program with Pastor James, offering pastoral support and a professional counselor conducting sessions twice a month. Maurice's suspension became a public process, an investigative window of 67 days during which evidence would be consolidated and an external auditor would be invited. The town's river filter was cleaned and its pump repaired. The symbolism of clean water for clean process was not lost on anyone. 3 months later, the ledger showed both receipts and refusals. Maurice's name appeared on the list of suspended contractors. His business dealings with the municipality were reviewed and a formal procurement freeze had been enacted. He accepted a mediated meeting and apologized publicly. But the apology met with guarded acceptance and a call for monitored reparations. The community committee agreed on restitution, funding for classes, an independent complaint hotline, and a public portal where contracts would be posted. The jar of coins had paid for part of the legal filing and the printing of pamphlets about consent and civic recourse. At 1 month, Sarian taught the first mending class under the tamarind, fingers showing others how to knot thread so it would not slip. At 3 months, the municipal notice board displayed a new code of conduct and a list of committee members. Tomas chaired, Mira and Rosa served, and Officer Ellis was named liaison. At 6 months, the river filter's maintenance schedule was public and the jar of coins had become a small reserve for community emergencies. The final scene collapses into a quiet image. Sarian sits at a small wooden table in the house where the roof still leaks in one corner, but the blue scarf now rests near the lamp, a fresh seam running the length of it. She stitches a new piece into the old burn line, drawing the thread through like a promise with a needle's point. The tamarind shadow moves across the floor in the late light. She thinks of forgiveness as a set of steps, not forgetting, not absolving, but choosing to reweave inside of the facts and the witnesses. If this story leaves you thinking about your own town, about what it would take for truth to be named and held, reflect on who would be on your committee, what your jar of coins would buy, and how you would teach the next generation to mend rather than to forget. If you want more stories about communities deciding to repair, subscribe for future pieces and share this one to start conversations where you live. She pulled the thread through the worn cloth until the stitch sat flush against the old burn, then paused and let the needle rest on her finger for a moment as if to feel the town's slow heartbeat. Outside, the tamarind's leaves whispered. The market's voices braided into the evening. Maurice's volunteers were turned down politely. Restitution was not to be an act of charity performed in the shadow of the harmed. The committee's policy was not to let penance masquerade as leverage. The external auditor's report arrived folded and formal. It had the quiet weight of a document that did not aspire to be grandiose. It enumerated misapplied funds, gaps in procurement, and a series of recommendations. Suspension of Maurice's company from municipal bidding for a fixed term, mandatory disclosure protocols for all future contracts, and a monitored restitution plan that required direct funding of the training programs and legal support for complainants. The report's language, technical, neutral, was less important than the fact that it existed and that it would sit on the municipal desk where anyone could read it. Mira photocopied it and penned a summary to the notice board in large, careful handwriting. Not everyone welcomed the outcome. There were threats, some coarse comments etched on the fence by the market, and a few quiet businesses that closed under pressure. But there were also gestures of solidarity that knitted differently. A seamstress in the North Quarter who taught an extra class for women returning to work. A mechanic who donated an afternoon to fix the notice board's broken hinge. A local baker who set aside a loaf every week for the jar's account to sell at the fair. Small economies of care sprang up where the old ones had frayed. Sarian found herself speaking at more meetings than she had imagined. She resisted eloquence. She preferred to tell small things. How to knot a thread so it didn't pull. How to watch the grain of fabric to know when it's time to stop pulling or to backtrack and start again. We have to be careful not to make mending mean forgetting, she told a row of parents and teens under the tamarind one afternoon. Mending isn't the same as erasing the burn. The new thread will always show. That's how we remember what we did. Her words did more work than she intended. Neighbors took note, and in backyard conversations their phrases about seeing the stitch began to sound like a communal creed. The counseling sessions with Pastor James continued to fill small rooms at the community center. He had been trained to listen without directing, to hold the space where guilt and grief could both be spoken. People arrived in fits and starts, some with the story of being taken advantage of, some with the perplexity of having trusted poorly, some with the challenge of forgiving in order to live side by side. Pastor James's work was not to erase consequences, but to help neighbors decide how they would be with one another after those consequences were known. He used scripture rarely and carefully, preferring instead human phrases that let a person feel buoyant rather than preached at. We make a place for sorrow, he would say, and then we decide what comes next. The jar remained on the table beneath the tamarind, now glass and labeled in neat black lettering. It was still a small altar only insofar as it concentrated the town's commitments. It funded a neighborhood legal aid kiosk where someone could get help filing a complaint without fear of retaliation. It covered the printing of pamphlets, folded sheets about consent, line drawings that showed how to say no and how to listen. And it paid for a stipend that enabled women to attend the labor rights sessions in the evenings without losing the wages they'd otherwise earn. In the months that followed, the hotline logged complaints that were not dramatic but necessary. A subcontractor who had been paid late, a foreman who skipped protective gear, a whispered report of a man who made a worker uncomfortable in the break room. Each case was triaged, some resolved through mediation, some moved to the municipal auditor. The system's existence changed the pattern of silence. People began to imagine their own towns as places where a complaint could be given and taken seriously, rather than being a thing to be swallowed for fear of losing a job. School children who had first watched the mending classes under the tamarind began to perform riffs on the idea at home. A group of fifth-grade girls created a small booklet replete with doodled stitches and pithy sentences about how to ask for help. They sold it at a market stall and put the proceeds in the jar. Teachers reported that the new language of boundaries made playground disagreements less likely to escalate. The phrase, "show me your stitch," became a code for asking consent before correcting or touching someone. One late autumn day, the committee organized a repair fair to mark a year since the jar's creation. It was modest, a row of stalls with swap tools, a booth for labor rights, a music corner where a local group played laments and then simpler, bright tunes. But the fair's purpose was earnest. It declared in public that repair required celebration as well as accountability. Families brought quilts mended from old clothes. Couples brought signs describing how they learned to say no and yes in better proportion. There was a wall where people could pin notes of what they'd learned. I learned to listen. I learned my right to say no. I learned to keep a copy of the invoice. Maurice came to the fair as well, as had been negotiated in the restitution plan. He stood on the edge of the crowd, hands folded, and watched. Some stared, others ignored him. He tried to speak to a few people, offering banal apologies. "I didn't think," that landed like thin paper on the ground. Tomas approached him once and then walked away, having asked a question about whether the money he offered would go to vocational classes rather than to contracts. Maurice agreed. The committee insisted on independent accounting. The day closed without a single grand absolution, which felt by design like the right sort of ending, healing without spectacle. Sarian taught a sewing demonstration near the tamarind. A small girl with fierce braids brought her own rag of a doll and asked Sarian to mend its arm. As Sarian worked, she explained in the girl's careful ear the difference between covering damage and attending to it. "You make the arm hold again," she said. "You do not make the hurt disappear." The girl nodded solemnly, as if the stitch were a kind of truth-telling. There were moments, quiet ones, when anger returned to the surface. A mother in the North Quarter wept in Counselor Alvarez's office not because someone had taken money, but because her child, once a witness, now struggled in school with the memory of being asked to keep silent. A teacher noticed and adapted classroom practices, giving children more options to speak. The committee added trauma-informed training to its list of requirements for anyone working with young people. It was slow, bureaucratic work. A new clause here, a revised contract there, but it accumulated into a different expectation about how public life would operate. The Municipal Council, at the request of the committee, passed a small but significant ordinance about transparency. Not every contract needed to be published in full, the council agreed, but essential procurement information, the vendor's name, the scope of work, the funding source, would be made available. Tomas sat through the debate and later admitted he had been surprised by how many of his peers were moved by simple facts. "People don't fear data," he said to Mira afterward. "They fear what hides in its place." A year and a half after the jar had first appeared beneath the tamarind, Sarian received a letter. It was not the kind of envelope that usually came with civic news. It was hand-folded and slightly browned at the edges. Inside was a short note from one of the women who had pressed a complaint early on. She thanked Sarian for the classes and for showing up at the municipal meeting. She wrote that her daughter had returned to work and that they had been able to enroll in a tailoring program paid for by the restitution fund. "We are mending," the letter read, "not pretending it never broke, mending it in front of people who will notice the stitch." Sarian kept that note folded into the blue scarf for a while, next to the fresh seam. She did not take it as full vindication. No one in town expected a single action to erase the harm, but as evidence that the choices they'd made had consequences that landed in people's lives. The jar's money had done quiet, precise things. It had bought time for healing, taught people to value the seam as well as the garment, and made the cost of silence visible. Maurice's legal restrictions remained in effect for a term, longer than some thought fair and shorter than others demanded. He was required to attend financial management workshops and to contribute to a community fund administered by the committee. He began, awkwardly, to work in small trades that did not require municipal approval. Some nights he sat alone at the edge of the market and read ledgers as if trying to find a different language for his day. People watched him, and sometimes they met his gaze with impatience or pity, sometimes with a weary sort of curiosity. Reconciliation, whatever shape it might take, was always a winding path. Repair had its raggedness. People moved at different paces. Some forgave quickly and with relief. Others kept records, not for vengeance, but as proof against repetition. With time, the town's culture shifted. It became harder to hide a contract and harder to treat a complaint as a private inconvenience. New social norms, transparent lists, independent hotlines, mandatory briefings made misconduct more costly and therefore less likely. But the town also learned gentleness, that the people who erred were not always incorrigible, that many mistakes came from hunger, from pressure, from being taught to keep one's head down. Late one afternoon, months after the fair, Sarian walked past the river where the children had laid stones to form a tiny dam. They had made a pattern that looked like stitches from above. She sat on the low wall and watched them throw pebbles. A boy she had taught to knot thread came up with his doll and asked if she remembered how to make a loop. She showed him, steadying his small fingers. He looked up at her as the loop formed and grinned, proud and private. "Do you think it will stay?" he asked. "Not always," she said, "but it will hold for the next thing you need to do." As evening softened the market, people drifted toward the tamarind where the jar sat, glass catching the light. Sarian reached out and placed a coin inside. She felt the familiar weight in her palm, not heavy so much as necessary, like a promise she kept to herself. Around her, voices rose in conversation, some loud, some tired, some delighted at the day's small victories. The shadow of the tree stretched across the ground. Beyond it, the pump sang quietly as water moved clean through the filter they had paid to fix. She thought, not for the first time, of the ledger and of the list of committee names on the municipal board. Names mattered. They were a way of saying who stood witness. She thought of Grandpa Heron's story about mending sails, of Mira's quiet choices, of Tomas's careful meetings, of Officer Ellis's persistent presence and Pastor James's patient listening. These were stitches too, other people's threads woven alongside her own. The town had not returned to a pristine state. Things were still messy, but the pattern had changed. Where there had been secrets and unaccountable promises, now there were processes that could be spoken of and tested. Where there had been a single man who could bend rules with a smile, there now stood a small, communal insistence on being seen. It was a modest triumph, perhaps, but it changed who could imagine staying in that town and why. As dusk settled, Sarian folded the blue scarf and slipped it into her basket. She rose and walked toward the market stall where children traded marbles and a woman with a new business card had set up a small seamstress sign. A girl tugged her sleeve and asked if the mending class would return next week. Sarian smiled and answered yes. The class would continue as long as there were people who needed to learn how to make a stitch that would hold. She paused beneath the tamarind, felt the rough bark against her palm, and let the last light slip through the leaves. The town's work was not finished, she knew. Oversight required constant tending, as seams required rechecking after hard work. But the choice the town had made, to place the jar where anyone could see it, to post the ledger publicly, to teach children to ask before they touched, had already altered the way they lived together. That, in her mind, counted for more than any single apology pinned to a council minute. She walked home slowly, the market's clatter behind her and the blessed hush of a roof with a newly mended leak ahead. The blue scarf would be ready for the next day, a small, visible reminder that a person could carry a repair and be both stronger and marked by it. Tonight she would rest, stitching in her dreams perhaps, thinking of the ways a town might continue to choose sight over secrecy. Outside, someone added a new coin to the jar beneath the tamarind. It rang steady and clear. The sound threaded into the evening like a single, decisive stitch.